Rory Boudreau was 12. He got his thick southern drawl from his mama, who was Cajun, and his dusky skin tone mostly from his daddy, who had been black. Rory's daddy was killed by a voodoo priestess back in Louisiana. Not long after that, his mama, Antoinette, moved them from New Orleans to the Pink Flamingos trailer park in Nevermore Hollows, Georgia. On the very day that he and his mom were moving into the sad, run-down trailer park, he'd been unloading boxes from the truck, wondering if there were any other kids his age with which he could share his love for adventure, when a skinny, red-headed boy walked into the yard. That was Stevie Muse. He was also 12, and with his red hair and freckles, he looked like he'd stepped right out of an ad from the 1950s about American exceptionalism. Stevie didn't have a dad either. His dad wasn't killed or anything, just a douchebag who'd run off the day he was born. Stevie introduced himself and explained to Rory that there weren't many kids in the park, and that they were either mean or off in a way that was hard to explain. The two boys clicked as if they'd been destined to meet. They were now as close as brothers and had shared a dozen paranormal adventures, many of which had almost resulted in their demise, like that time Professor Grieve kidnapped them, tied them to a couple of sarcophagi inside a mausoleum, and attempted to cut them to pieces with a straight razor. For those who cared to pay attention, they'd noticed that Rory was the impulsive one that got them into trouble, but Stevie was the clever one that found them a way out. The boys and their dog, a husky border collie mixed named MacReady, stood at the sales counter of their favorite store, listening to Elwood Romero, the owner of Romero's Comics and Games, as he told them the story of the Haunted Junkyard that was located far out on County Road 27. Elwood was a 40-ish man who looked nothing like the stereotypical comic shop owner. That was because he always wore a black suit with a skinny tie and a white button-down shirt, topped off with a pair of retro tapered side eyeglasses. He looked as if he had stepped out of a 1960s men's fashion magazine. The boys had come to the shop to pick up their monthly haul of comics, which wasn't much because they were sons of single mothers who lived off waitress salaries. Though they were poor in money, they were rich in wonder. As they were purchasing their comics, they had asked Elwood what the most famous horror comic was. Elwood had responded that it was issue number 22 of Crime Suspense Stories that was published by EC Comics back in April of 1954. This particular comic had displayed a decapitation of a pretty blonde woman on the cover, drawn by the masterful Johnny Craig. After the publication of this comic, the Comics Code Authority was created to protect innocent minds such as theirs from such gruesome imagery. But there is one specific copy of this issue that is the most sought after, Elwood said. It was signed by Johnny Craig, but it was also signed by Stephen King and none other than the man himself, my cousin and director of Night of the Living Dead, Mr. George Romero. "Wow," the boys said in unison. Then Rory asked in his thick Cajun patois, "That sure would be awesome to own." "Oh, for sure," Elwood said. "It belonged to my granddad, Moses Romero, who had bought it as a kid. He always kept it sealed in an airtight comic container so that it was in pristine condition. One day, back in 1984, Granddad Moses got invited by George to a luncheon he was having with Stephen and Johnny. So Granddad took his copy of the book and had them all sign it." "So you've seen it?" Stevie asked, awe in his voice. Elwood gave a slow shrug. No, I've never gotten to see it. It was lost. MacReady gave a surprised snort, as if he found it difficult that someone could lose something so valuable and cool. Then Stevie said, "How?" Elwood straightened his glasses. "Well, see, after getting the book signed, my granddad Moses was driving back here to Nevermore in his 1956 cherry red Chevy Nomad, and he just disappeared. His car was seen by 4 different people that night, parked on the side of the road. But then, by the next morning, it too was missing." "What you think happened to him?" Rory asked. "Nobody knows," Elwood said. "But I think he broke down and walked over to the Haunted Junkyard to get help." The boys exchanged a wide-eyed glance. Then they turned their eager faces toward Elwood. "There's a haunted junkyard in Nevermore Hollows?" Stevie asked. Elwood was quite the raconteur. He knew how to manipulate his inflections and body language to draw the boys into the story. "Oh, yes," he said. "It's on County Road 27, near where my granddad's car broke down. Nobody knows who owns it or for how long it's existed. There's no business license on file at the courthouse. There's no record of ownership anywhere. All we know is that it has been part of Nevermore Hollows as long as there have been cars. And if you ride down County Road 27, you'll eventually find it. But it's surrounded by a wooden fence." Rory's and Stevie's faces were masks of wonder. Even MacReady seemed to be enchanted because he stared intently at Elwood as he spoke. After a moment, Stevie asked, "Has anybody ever attempted to get inside, though?" Even though they were the only people in the shop, Elwood gave a conspiratorial glance around, as if making sure they were truly alone. The boys couldn't help but to also cast cautious looks. MacReady gave a wary chuff. Once they all agreed that they were alone, Elwood leaned over the glass counter, which was filled with all kinds of strange and spooky curiosities. "Yes, once," he said in a stage whisper. "It was the very next day after my granddad disappeared. The sheriff at the time and 5 deputies went inside looking for him. They were gone for 2 whole days, and when they returned, they looked like they'd seen something terrible. They were gaunt, with hollow looks in their eyes. The deputies resigned and moved away, and the sheriff checked himself into Morning Star Sanitarium. To this day, he keeps babbling about being attacked by the junkyard zombies, saying that they were covered in the rust of the old cars and trucks that littered the place. But see, boys, here's the thing. He and all the deputies say that they saw my granddad's Nomad." There was a long, quiet moment where the boys let their imaginations conjure up vivid details of Elwood's story. Rory, in his thick Cajun patois, said, "Them zombies all be covered in rust? What you think that be about?" Stevie's eyes were wide. He was totally caught up in the magic of the story. Not realizing he was whispering, he asked, "Is it voodoo?" The corner of Elwood's mouth quirked into a smile. He adjusted his glasses and leaned further over the glass counter, closer to the boys. Well, it could be voodoo or some other black magic, he said in such a low voice that the boys literally leaned in to better hear. The junkyard does jut into Dunwich Forest, and we all know that there's something wrong about that place. Personally, I think the rain mixes with the tainted soil there and causes the rust to have some sort of reanimating property. The four of them stood in the coffin-like quiet of the comic shop. The boys were grinning, and MacReady gave a quiet chuff that indicated he was also enjoying the spooky story. Their minds were conjuring up images of blood-colored rust and hordes of the undead shambling about the junkyard. "Wow," Stevie said. "Yeah," Rory said. "That'd be cool." "Oh, but I caution you boys," Elwood said. "Don't go near that place, let alone go inside. It's just not worth looking for my granddad's nomad or the comic, because supposedly it is guarded by the Bull Man." "What's the Bull Man?" Stevie whispered. Elwood leaned even closer, grasping the edge of the glass case. He was literally hovering over the boys. "No one knows exactly. They've only caught glimpses of him. They say he's a 7-foot-tall man who suffers from a skull deformity. His face is clearly human, but the skull beneath the skin distorts it into something that looks like a hybrid of man and bull. People say that part of his unfortunate deformity is that he has 2 long growths protruding from his head that resemble gnarled horns. Now, some of the folks think he's as cannibalistic as the zombies that haunt the junkyard, and that he will eat anyone he catches, so don't even think about it, boys. Don't. It's just too dangerous." Suddenly, the bell over the door jangled, jerking the boys and their dog out of the trance created by Elwood's delectable tale. They looked up to see a group of teenagers enter the store. "Ah," Elwood said, "they're here for the Dungeons and Dragons quest I'm hosting this afternoon. Now, you boys run along and stay out of trouble." The boys and MacReady exited the store and sat on the sidewalk and considered what Elwood had told them. "I can't believe we've never heard this story," Stevie said. Stories like this always whetted the boys' appetite for adventure. Rory gave a mischievous grin. "I sure would like to take a look at that place." "Well, I'm up for it, but I don't think we have enough time," Stevie replied. "It'll be dark in a couple of hours." "I ain't saying we go into the junkyard tonight," Rory said. "I say we just ride out and take a peek. Just scout it out. We could always go back in the morning." Stevie calculated the distance from where they were, which was in the middle of town on Main Street, to the junkyard. "On our bikes it would take about an hour or so, and then from there it would be about an hour back home, and that would put us at home just at sundown." The boys put the comics they had purchased in a backpack that they shared. It also held 2 flashlights, matches, some rope, and bottles of water and energy bars. Stevie slipped the backpack onto his shoulders, and they climbed on their rusty bikes and headed off down Main Street and out of town. MacReady padded along between them. He had a happy but determined look on his furry face as he glanced around for potential danger. It was a mild day, and the sun played peekaboo behind the armada of white, puffy clouds that sailed across the sea-blue sky. A lazy breeze carried the scent of the ocean, which lay a couple miles east of town. They made good time once they were beyond the town limits because there was almost no traffic, and they had full access of the road. Eventually, they rounded a curve and saw the 20-foot-long gravel drive that served as an entrance to the junkyard. They cut across the road and stopped at the wooden gate, which was secured with a rusty length of chain and a massive padlock. Both the chain and the padlock looked as if they had not been used for decades. A weathered rectangle of wood had been secured to the gate as a makeshift sign. Someone had used red paint to scrawl "Danger" inside. But the D was badly faded, almost too light to see, thus spelling out "Anger" inside. Under the word was a crudely drawn skull and crossbones. They propped their bikes against the fence and took a few minutes to drink some water. Stevie fished a small bowl out of the backpack and poured some for MacReady. Once they had all three hydrated themselves, they peered through the gaps in the picket boards. The gravel drive extended for about 40 yards into the junkyard, ending at a small building painted in black and white stripes of peeling paint. Under the eaves was a rusty row of time-yellowed fluorescent bulbs. There was a window set in the center of the wall facing the road. It had a long, jagged crack and was covered with a cataract of dirt. Beyond the building, there were what appeared to be hundreds of vehicles of all makes and models from various decades scattered about. Some were stacked 3 and 4 high, and they carried on as far as the boys could see. "This place be big," Rory said. "I bet it goes on for at least 10 acres, Stevie said, "all the way back into the forest." There was a quiet moment when the boys considered this information. Nevermore Hollows was surrounded on 3 sides by Dunwich Forest, which always seemed dark no matter how bright the day was. No one willingly ventured inside, not even hunters. "We sure don't want to get lost when we in there." As if to affirm Rory's statement, MacReady chuffed. Rory found a couple of wooden pickets that had come loose from most of their nails. He pulled them free. The gap was now large enough to allow them to pass through. "Well, look at this. We can just go in and take a peek." "There isn't enough time," Stevie said, "and we agreed to just find the place today. We only have about an hour before it starts getting dark." But even as Stevie said this, he knew he would give in to the powerful allure of adventure. "Well, what say we just sneak in and take a look at that building over there?" Rory said. "Maybe there be something inside there that will help us narrow our search for our comic book when we come back." Stevie smiled and nodded. "Okay, but in and out, Rory. I mean it." Rory crossed his heart. "I promise, or I'll eat that roadkill possum we done saw on the road back there." He slipped inside and motioned for Stevie to pass the bikes through. Then Stevie and MacReady stepped into the junkyard. There was a stillness inside the fence that was unnerving. The breeze seemed blocked by the fence. There was no bird song, no occasional lowing of cows from the farms that they had passed on their way to the junkyard. It was as if they had stepped into a bubble where only the junkyard existed. The boys exchanged a glance. MacReady gave a low grunt that they had learned to interpret as a call for them to be cautious. They stood for a moment, listening, glancing around, looking for any danger. Finally, Rory started pushing his bike toward the building. Stevie followed, pushing his own bike while MacReady padded beside him, glancing around, on watch for any danger. The only sound was the crunching of the gravel under their feet. Even that was muted, as if they were inside a room lined with soundproofing panels. They made it to the building and used their hands to wipe the dust from the window, but it was just as caked with grime on the inside of the glass, and they were unable to see into the gloomy room beyond. They stepped around the building and saw a door in the back wall. They dropped their bikes, and Stevie grabbed the doorknob and gave it a twist. "It's unlocked." Rory nodded to him to push it open. The door creaked on its hinges, revealing nothing but gloom. Stevie shrugged out of the backpack and retrieved a flashlight. He set the backpack on the ground beside the door and switched on the light. He leaned across the threshold and shined it around. There was a main room with a counter built under the window. Along the back wall were shelves littered with boxes and various car parts. To their left was a door. It was ajar, but not enough to let them see what was behind it, but was most likely a storage room. To their right were two large metal filing cabinets. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. In the corners, spiders had built elaborate webs that glimmered dully in the flashlight beam. "It doesn't look like anybody's been in here for a long time," Stevie said. "Oh, man, and what's that smell? It's gross." Rory stepped into the room. "Smells like something done died." Stevie grabbed the backpack and followed Rory. He grimaced at the smell. "Yeah, that's pretty nasty." "Something just don't feel right," Rory said. "I feel it too," Stevie replied. "It's so quiet. Even our voices seem flat and muffled." "Ain't just that," Rory said. "I got a tingle down my back like we being watched." MacReady went rigid, dropped his head low, and took up a defensive position between the boys and the storage room. "What is it, boy?" Stevie asked. Both he and Rory felt their skin prickle. Just then, as if in answer to Stevie's question, a deep, rumbling growl came from the storage room. "Aw, man, it about to get real," Rory said. The door squeaked open, revealing an enormous mixed-breed dog that was part pit bull, part Rottweiler, but all junkyard nasty. It was a tight mass of rippling muscle covered in short hair that was so black it seemed to have been made from the Grim Reaper's cloak. And instead of one massive head sprouting from its immense chest, it had three. A corroded name tag dangled from an old leather collar around the middle neck, declaring that this beast's name was Stank. The name was appropriate, because the dog was also the source of the terrible smell. Flies buzzed around it as if it had just wallowed on a corpse in a shallow grave. "That's a lot of teeth, Stevie." Stevie shot a quick glance over his shoulder at the door behind them. He calculated that he and Rory were 3 paces away. They could make it, especially if MacReady stood his ground. But then what would happen to MacReady? He looked at Rory, saw that he had also done the calculations and that he had come to the same conclusion. They would not leave MacReady. They would fight this beast together. But it would be hard enough to fight a single ferocious dog with only one head and one mouthful of flesh-ripping teeth. This dog was triple the danger. Stevie knew that Rory was a stand-your-ground kind of guy. He would face this danger head-on, which is what must happen in many cases where one is faced with a mortal threat. But Stevie had used his brain more than once to escape potentially deadly situations, and he knew that the only way for all 3 of them to survive this encounter was for him to use his brain now, and fast. His heart hammered in his chest, making it difficult to think. He forced himself to focus and glanced around, looking for a solution. Stank took a bold step from the storage room. One set of its black eyes was locked on MacReady, who stood tense and ready for battle. The other sets were locked on to the boys. Then, As if to take a step around MacReady, the dog lifted a massive paw, but hesitated when MacReady gave a warning bark. The beast replied with a defiant growl from one head and hungry moans from the other two. Stevie reasoned from Stank's response that the three heads might not be completely in sync with each other on how best to handle this situation. One of the heads wanted to tear into MacReady, the other two wanted to eat the boys, and Stevie could see and feel the tension coming from the beast. It was clearly having some sort of internal struggle. He needed to act before the heads came to an agreement. Rory? Rory was scared but kept it under control. His eyes were locked on the beast. Yeah? I got a plan. Rory nodded. I'm listening. We need to do it fast. Old Stanky is looking hungry. Stevie nodded. I'm going to count to 3. Then I want you to run for the door. Ain't leaving you, Stevie. I'm going to be right behind you. Rory, eyes still locked on Stank, said, What about MacReady? Upon hearing his name, MacReady twitched his ears. The boys understood that he was letting them know that he was listening. MacReady, you too, Stevie said. I want you to run on 3. Got it? MacReady twitched his ear. He got it. Stank's internal struggle seemed to be coming to an end because it took a step closer toward them. It was 4 feet from MacReady, and thick drool poured from all 3 of its mouths. It tensed its body, clearly getting ready to make a move. The head that was focused on Rory lifted and gave a loud, hungry bark. So what you thinking, Stevie? I'm going to throw the backpack at it, Stevie said. I think it will distract him and give us enough time to get out the door. In normal Rory fashion, he gave a cavalier reply. Well, that sucks. Our comics are in there. We ain't going to get to read what happens to Mighty Snail. Mighty Snail was a comic written and drawn by an independent creator named Mr. Overlord. It was about 2 aliens that looked like anthropomorphic snails that had crash-landed in Japan. These 2 aliens vowed to become the greatest superheroes that Japan had ever seen. They fought various strange villains that lived in the sea around the island. Well, Stevie replied, if we get out of here, we can always write Mr. Overlord and tell him that his comic book literally saved our lives. Stevie could see a smile twitch at the corner of Rory's mouth. I like it. He glanced at MacReady. You ready, boy? MacReady twitched an ear and gave a throaty chuff. He was ready. 1, Stevie said. MacReady tensed, ready to go, and attempting to distract Stank, he raised his head and barked a ferocious warning. 2, Stevie said. He held the backpack by its straps. He slowly reared back, ready to throw. Stank, in response to MacReady's warning bark, raised all 3 of its heads and let out long, angry howls that were clearly a call to battle. Then it lurched forward, full of slavering, tooth-filled ferocity. Stevie yelled, 3! He tossed the backpack directly at Stank, hitting him square in the chest. Stank jerked back, temporarily caught off guard. Stevie and Rory shot through the door. MacReady hesitated for only a second until he was sure the boys were clear. Then, while Stank used all its mouths to shred the backpack, MacReady turned and ran through the door. Stevie slammed it closed and hoped it would be enough to keep the beast inside. Then he and Rory climbed on their bikes with the intent of racing back to the gate and escaping through the fence. But as they rounded the corner of the building, Stank smashed through the front window in a spray of glass and blocked their way. Rory and Stevie slid their bikes around and headed down the gravel path that led deeper into the junkyard. MacReady ran between them. Stank chased after them, snarling and howling and throwing thick ropes of drool from its mouths. The boys pedaled like mad down a long corridor that was created by rows of tightly stacked cars and trucks. They were stacked 2 and in some cases 4 high. Some had been flattened, some had not. All were damaged in various ways. 30 yards in front of them, the vehicles had been stacked in such a way that they formed a narrow opening that was capped off by an older car, one of those from the 1950s that had a massive chrome grille with big round headlights. The grille was dented and rusty and looked down upon them like a leering metallic jester as they passed under it. Stank skidded to a stop at the entryway. He did not follow the boys through, but instead he took a menacing stance, raised his heads, and let loose a blood-freezing howl. Then he sat on his haunches, back straight, eyes forward and alert, as if he were standing guard at the gates of hell. Rory and Stevie pedaled 40 yards further before they stopped at a wall of flattened trucks. At that point, 2 new paths split off from this main path, one to the left, another to the right. MacReady again positioned himself between the boys and the beast. Rory said, "The way he just be sitting there don't make me feel too good." "Yeah," Stevie replied. "I don't like it either." "Well, at least he ain't chasing us no more," Rory said. "For now," Stevie replied, "but he might change his mind and come at us at some point." "It'll be dark soon," Rory said. "I know," Stevie replied, "and I don't want to be caught in here at night. We need to figure something out." "Well, it ain't going to be going out the front gate," Rory said. "And the way all these cars be stacked, it might be tricky trying to climb on top of them to get away." Stevie had come to the same conclusion. "Yeah, I know, especially with MacReady. He's something special, but he isn't a cat." Rory gestured at the 2 paths they were presented with. "Well, then it seems we got to go deep and find another way out." "I don't know if that's the best thing to do," Stevie said. "But maybe we can find a place where there's a break in the wall of cars and we can make it to the fence, or maybe we can even find a place where we can help MacReady climb." While the boys discussed their strategy, Stank sat at the entryway and watched. The boys glanced down each path. Both proceeded about 40 yards, then took a 90-degree turn deeper into the junkyard. "Aight," Rory said. "You choose. Right or left?" "I feel that either's going to be a bad decision," Stevie said, "but let's just go left." Rory nodded. "I know this ain't what we planned, but since we're here, we might as well just keep our eyes out for Granddaddy Romero's Nomad, right? No sense in wasting an opportunity to find that comic book." Stevie cut his eyes toward his friend. Part of him wanted to scold Rory for making light of their current situation. But the other part, the one that was more dominant, was no less eager for the adventure of finding such a treasure. So he shrugged. "Yeah, it can't hurt to keep our eyes open. The car should be easy to find, even if it's squashed. I mean, how many cherry red 56 Nomads could there be in here?" They glanced back at Stank. He sat hunched, staring at them. Though neither of them said so, they both felt that the beast's mouths were pulled back into malicious sneers, as if it knew something that they did not. Stevie turned left and pedaled down the path. Rory followed, and MacReady locked his eyes with Stank one last time, letting him know that should he try anything, he would have a fight on his hands. Then MacReady gave a derisive chuff and followed the boys. This new part of the path carried on for about 30 yards, then ended at another wall of cars. However, there were 2 new paths from which they could choose, one on each side. Stevie had a revelation. "This junkyard has been laid out like a maze." "Yeah, I see that," Rory said. "I just be thinking that. Let's take a right this time." The boys pedaled, and MacReady padded a few steps behind them in case Stank decided to show up. They continued like this for 10 minutes, evenly splitting their choices between right and left when coming upon a junction. Twice they wandered into dead ends and had to backtrack. They had moved deep enough into the junkyard that they were now in the part that jutted into Dunwich Forest, and the sun had finally descended below the tops of those trees, casting long shadows across the small clearing. Darkness was not upon them, but it was close. "Stevie? Yeah? I think we gonna be stuck here after dark." Stevie gave a slow nod. "Yeah, I know." "Sorry, man," Rory said. "I didn't expect this to happen." Stevie shrugged. "Neither did I, but we should have. It always happens to us." They rounded a corner and saw a small clearing with an old car from the 1940s sitting in the center. It looked like it had been rolled in a terrible accident. The windows were smashed, and the roof was crunched in, and one door was missing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the trunk of the car, came a muffled pounding. MacReady gave a low growl. The boys sensed the same danger that MacReady did, and they knew they had to act. But this wasn't their first encounter with danger. They had learned to be smart, assess first, act second. There was another round of muffled pounding. Just then, the sun finally gave its last breath and crawled into its nightly grave, and long black shadows scrambled across the clearing like hungry black souls. Even though evening had crept upon them, there was a strange light coming from the trees in the forest around them that lit up the junkyard in a putrid green glow. The pounding stopped, and the trunk popped open. Then, with the creak of rusty hinges, the lid was pushed up, and a dead man crawled out. They could tell he was dead because he was missing his lower jaw, and his skin was withered and in some places missing to reveal exposed bone. He wore jeans and the remnants of an old work shirt. The name patch over his left pocket stated his name had been Skeeter. A stained trucker hat sat askew on his head, and he was covered in what appeared to be a powdery film of crimson rust. "Oh, crap!" Stevie hissed. "It's one of the rust zombies." "What we do now?" Rory asked. "Stank is behind us and this guy be in front of us." Before Stevie could respond, they heard moaning from behind them. They turned and saw another rust-covered zombie crawling out of a car that sat at the bottom of a stack. It was a woman. She wore spandex leggings and a belly shirt with spaghetti straps. She had been a big girl when she was alive, and in death still retained her girth, though now it sagged like rancid blubber under her shirt and over her leggings. On her lower back was a tramp stamp tattoo that said, "Playboy Bunny." She pulled herself free and turned to look at the boys. She was missing an eye, and the back of her skull was caved in, and her long, greasy hair was caked with grime and gore. She smiled at the boys, and in a hungry slur said, "I'm gonna eat you tasty babies." "Time to go," Rory said. "Which way?" Stevie asked. "This way," Rory said. He shot off across the small clearing toward an opening that he hoped would be a safe exit. Stevie and MacReady followed. As they ran around the corner of the old car, Skeeter lurched after them, surprisingly fast. His tongue dangled from his exposed throat, and when he grunted at them, it wriggled like a withered snake. He grabbed hold of Rory's shirt and yanked. Rory twisted and punched the zombie between the eyes. MacReady snarled and latched onto Skeeter's arm and tugged. Skeeter lost his grip on Rory and swiped at MacReady, but the dog was too fast and jumped clear. He turned and followed Rory and Stevie as they ran toward another corridor of stacked cars and trucks. But before they could make it, they saw other zombies, all covered in that strange blood-colored rust, crawling from the vehicles. The boys were surrounded. They glanced around for another way out, but there appeared to be none. Bunny wobbled her way toward them. She pointed and said,
"I'm gonna eat you tasty babies."
Skeeter crept around them. His tongue writhed and dripped black, gooey saliva as he grunted in hunger. The zombies behind the boys all began to moan. Stevie knew he had to come up with something quickly. He glanced around, forcing his fear down, even though his heart hammered and his mind raced. Now, there were even more zombies crawling from the vehicles stacked around them. There must be at least a dozen now. Think, focus, see, he told himself. And then he did see a way. He pointed at an old station wagon that was at the bottom of a stack of cars to their left. It wasn't as crushed as some of the others, and he could see through the windows that there was another small clearing on the other side. "Rory," he said, pointing, "let's crawl through there." Rory clambered through the front door and across the seat. Stevie followed. MacReady was the last to crawl through. All the while, they could hear the zombies behind them closing in, all of them calling out their need to feed. When they had made it through to the other side, they realized that they were in a clearing that was even smaller than the one from which they had just escaped. But in the eerie green glow, they saw Granddad Romero's cherry red Nomad. It didn't even have a scratch on it, though it was faded from the elements. The doors were closed and the windows were all intact and rolled up. They ran toward it, but another rust zombie crawled out from under an old Ford truck and tried to block their way. It was a man dressed in cut-off jeans and a grease-stained tank top. It had a matted mullet and a Fu Manchu mustache. Its stomach had been chewed open by some animal, and it was missing both legs below the knees. But it swiped at them as they ran by. The boys juked out of its reach, and MacReady jumped over it, causing it to moan in hungry need. Rory reached the Nomad first and snatched the driver's door handle and gave it a pull. Thankfully, it opened but gave a long, rusty creak in protest. He scrambled inside, followed by MacReady and then Stevie, who shut the door behind him. "Quick, lock the passenger door," Stevie said. Rory complied by slapping down on the lock. Then he crawled into the back cargo hold and made sure the back hatch was secured. The zombies circled the Nomad. Some were able to walk. Some crawled. All were hungry. They clawed at the windows, scraped at the doors. Skeeter climbed onto the hood and pressed what was left of his face against the window. MacReady growled, and the boys grimaced when his dangling tongue left a thick trail of dark slime on the window. Bunny was clearly the strongest of the horde, which seemed to number at least a dozen. She wobbled into the fray and used her bulk to knock the other zombies out of the way. She slammed into the passenger side of the car, causing it to rock back and forth.
"Ain't gonna wait no more. Gonna eat you tasty babies all up, gnaw on your bones."
Rory, knowing that it was Stevie who usually found a way out of their predicament, said, "What be the plan, Stevie?" Stevie tore his eyes away from Skeeter, who was now making a hungry, gurgling sound from his exposed throat. It caused more of that dark slime to splatter across the windshield. He took in the other members of the rotting undead horde as they tugged at the door handles and crawled on top of the nomad. Then he gave Rory a grim look and shook his head. "I don't know, Rory. I think we're going to have to fight our way out of here." Rory didn't like the look on his friend's face. They'd been in desperate situations before, but they'd always figured a way out or had gotten lucky and been saved by their best friend and father figure, Ivan Ivanovich, who was the live-in custodian at the trailer park where they lived. He understood Stevie's concern. They were surrounded, and the glass in this old nomad wouldn't hold forever. "There has to be something we can do." Stevie shook his head. "We fight," he said. "With what?" Rory replied. Stevie snatched open the glove box and gave a surprised hoot that seemed so out of context in their dire situation. He held up the EC comic of Crime Suspense Stories number 22. It was in a sealed comic container, in pristine condition. "I found the comic." "That's cool," Rory said. He looked happily surprised, then flinched when one of the zombies began slamming its head against the rear window. "But it ain't going to do us any good if we die." Stevie closed his eyes for a heartbeat and tried to calm his mind and escape the moaning and groaning that was coming from the zombies. Then his eyes shot wide. "Toolbox," he said. "These old cars always had a toolbox. Hopefully there's one in here and we can use some of the tools as weapons." Rory glanced around, saw that part of the cargo hold floorboard was designed with a hatch that could be opened to reveal what he assumed was the storage area for the spare tire. He flung open the hatch and saw not only the spare tire and toolbox, but also the car jack and a 2-foot-long tire iron that had a lug wrench on one end and a sharp end on the other. He snatched a toolbox and handed it across the seat to Stevie. He took the tire iron for himself. Just then, Bunny rammed her bulk into the driver's door, rocking the car, causing a long crack to form in the window. MacReady took up position between the cracked window and Stevie. Stevie threw open the toolbox and said, "Yes." Skeeter had crawled up onto the top of the nomad. It sounded as if he were jumping up and down, trying to crush the roof in. But the nomad was built in an age when pride and craftsmanship was king. The roof was holding. Bunny bent down and looked through the window.
"I'm coming to get you, tasty babies. I'm going to eat you all up. Slurp on your guts."
"Stevie," Rory said. "On it," Stevie replied. "I found something that might help us." The mullet zombie, the one missing its legs, had pulled itself up onto the back of the nomad. It was bashing its forehead against the glass set in the back hatch with such ferocity that broke away part of its skull and exposed part of its greasy, oil-colored brain. Rory held the tire iron with the sharp end at the ready in case the glass broke. Stevie removed a large can of WD-40 and an old Zippo lighter from the toolbox. He shook the can. It was full. He flicked the lighter. Nothing. He shook it and flicked it 3 more times. Then, to his relief, it lit with a flickering flame. "Okay, Rory," he said as he crawled into the cargo hold. "Here's the plan. We're going out the back. On the count of 3, you kick open the hatch, and I'm going to use these to create a WD-40 flamethrower." Rory's smirk was an incongruous mix of cavalier confidence and skeptical fatalism. He knew in his heart they were outnumbered and that this was probably going to be their last adventure. But at his very core, he was an optimist. And more than that, he'd come not only to believe in miracles, but to expect them. And that resonated with his spirit in a profound way. So he nodded and said, Carpe noctem. He and Stevie had learned that cool Latin phrase only a few nights ago. It meant seize the night, and they both thought it was pretty badass. Stevie gave a sly grin. He tucked the comic under his shirt behind the waistband of his shorts, grabbed the can of WD-40 and the lighter, and took up position beside Rory. MacReady gave a final warning bark at Bunny, who was using her bulk to rock the Nomad back and forth, and he jumped into the back cargo space. "You ready?" Rory asked. "Ready," Stevie said. Rory nodded. "Then let's get to it." Stevie flicked the lighter and held the can ready. Then he yelled, "3!" Rory kicked open the back hatch and jumped forward, swinging the tire iron. He hit 2 of the zombies, one in the face, the other in the neck. MacReady jumped out and attacked a female zombie who was dressed in a tattered purple terry cloth bathrobe. She was missing large clumps of hair from her rotting head, but what was left was done up with pink, big-barreled rollers. She groaned and kicked at MacReady, who juked away, then bit into the hem of her bathrobe and yanked her off balance. Stevie sent a spray of bright orange flame onto Skeeter, who had jumped off the top of the Nomad. Skeeter screeched and twisted away as his clothes caught fire and engulfed his withered body. "This way," Rory said as he shot around the back of the Nomad. The mullet zombie crawled out from under the car and grabbed his ankle. Rory slammed the sharp edge of the tire iron into the top of his head. Mullet zombie let go of Rory's ankle and snatched at the tire iron. Stevie shot a spray of flame, and the mullet zombie's long, greasy hair burned with a terrible stench. Rory was able to yank the tire iron free and charged forward, swinging it like a baseball bat. Stevie continued laying down a spray of fire, engulfing the zombies who were too close. MacReady snapped and snarled as he protected from the rear. Bunny waddled around in front of the Nomad and blocked their escape. She was massive, with her loose belly hanging nearly to her knees. Thick, hungry, nicotine-colored drool seeped from the corner of her mouth.
"I got you now, tasty babies. I got you."
"I'm thinking nope," Rory said, then rushed at her, the tire iron held high. He slammed it into her chest. It sunk deep, releasing a putrid stench as the gases trapped inside her mass were released. Then he twisted out of the way so that Stevie could hit her with a gout of flame. Stevie hit the button on the WD-40 and the flame washed over her. She screamed in rage, a string of profanity pouring from her as she stumbled back. The boys and the dog ran past her and headed toward the corridor at the far end of the clearing, hoping that it would lead them to safety. But when they were only 10 yards away, they heard a deep, loud snort. Then the bull man stepped out of the shadows and blocked their way. The boys stifled their gasps of shock. He was a tall black man, easily pushing 6'8", and was abnormally thick. There didn't seem to be an ounce of fat on his body. He wasn't rippling with muscle honed by years in a gym, but instead he had layers of iron-hard muscle that one gets from decades of hard work. But even though his size was fearsome, his face and horns were the stuff of nightmares. His face was fully human, but the structure of his skull was misshapen in such a way that it gave him a deformed nose and mouth that jutted out like that of a bull. The horns were not slick and shiny like those of a real bull, but instead they were black and gnarled and twisted, thick at the skull and tapering off into sharp tips. The boys would later recall that they looked more like twisted branches than actual horns, and his exposed skin was covered in old scars. The boys were trapped, and they feared their time on this earth was done. But then, the zombies that were left standing saw Bull Man and stopped cold. They stood wary, eager, hungry. Bullman took in the scene. He wore bib overalls with no shirt and a pair of heavy work boots. And when he spoke, his voice sounded as if his tongue was too thick.
You shouldn't be here.
Then he glared at the zombies. He took in a deep breath and roared.
Go, now. Leave these boys and this dog be.
In unison, the zombies jerked in fear and lumbered back into the depths of the junkyard. The only ones left were the mullet zombie, who appeared to have finally died from Rory's tire iron to the brain, and Bunny, who was lying in a burning, sizzling heap. To the boys' surprise, MacReady took a couple of steps toward Bullman, his tail wagging. Bullman looked down at MacReady. A deformed smile crossed his mutated face. Then he squatted and scratched the dog behind the ears. He looked at the boys.
You boys nearly died tonight. What are you doing here?
Rory and Stevie watched the giant mutant give MacReady a friendly scratch and took in the fact that MacReady was clearly loving the moment. Then they came to the only plausible conclusion. Bullman was not a threat. Stevie produced the comic book from under his shirt. "We came to get this," he said. "We were told by Mr. Romero at the comic shop that it was in that Nomad which belonged to his granddad." Bullman stood, glanced at the car.
All these years, that comic was there and I didn't know it.
Rory found Bullman's comment curious. "What you mean?"
Well, I love comics. But ever since I've been stuck in this hellhole, I've not been able to partake in such delights.
"Well, how long have you been here?" Stevie asked. Bullman shrugged.
Hard to say. Time is different in this junkyard. A week for you is anywhere from a day to a year for me. Sometimes even the opposite of that is true. A week for me may be a day for you, or only a few minutes. Come on, I need to get you boys out of here before Talbot comes back.
"That mean-looking guy that drives around in that old tow truck?" Stevie asked. Bullman gave what the boys thought might be a frown.
Talbot is more than what he seems. Clearly you boys know that this area is full of evil things. So just mindless monsters acting on dark impulses. But others are very intelligent. And when they prey upon people passing through the county, they hire Talbot to haul their victims' vehicles back here. That way, nobody will know what happened.
"I knew I didn't like that guy," Rory said. "So, who are these zombies?"
Sometimes Talbot brings back the bodies of the victims. They get covered with this cursed rust and get reanimated. There are others that are what's left of the idiots that snuck into Steel but ended up dying here. Now, come on, follow me. Let's get you boys and your dog out of here.
He turned and led them back down the corridor of stacked cars and trucks that he'd come from. "Why are you here?" Stevie asked. "Yeah," Rory said. "Why don't you just leave?" When he responded, there was a sadness in his thick, deep voice.
Because I can't. I'm bound here as long as Talbot is alive. I can only be released once he's dead. It's a long story, not one you need to know now. Let's hurry before the zombies regroup and come after us.
Wait, Rory said. We gotta be careful. There's a big old three-headed dog that tried to kill us. Bullman gave a guttural chuckle.
Oh, that stank. He won't hurt you if you're with me. Besides, he was just doing his job.
MacReady gave a derisive chuff. The boys exchanged a dubious glance. I got a question, Rory said. Why them zombies be afraid of you?
I might be bound here, but I refuse to die here. No matter how hard those dead bastards try.
Rory and Stevie and MacReady followed the massive bullman through the junkyard maze in the greenish glow from the strange forest. They made their way to where they had abandoned their bikes and retrieved them. Then, after a while, they found themselves at the front gate. Stank stood guard. One head gave them an angry look. The other two heads simply drooled.
Now, you might be surprised what you see when you step out of this place. Remember, time works different in here. I forbid you from entering again, but I would be much obliged if you boys could start bringing me some comics to read. I have a lot of money that I've found in these junk cars over the years. I'll pay for what you pick up for me, but I'll also gladly pay for yours too, as a way of showing my gratitude.
The boys thought this was a wonderful idea. It made sense to them when Bullman said he wanted to stay away from any horror comics, but they were surprised when he said he'd really like to have a mixture of Archie comics and Superman. They agreed to come by every week with his haul, and he gave them each $100 bill, which was more money than any of the boys had ever seen in their lives.
Just let me know when you need more. I've got plenty.
He opened the gate, and the boys stepped out of the darkness of the junkyard into late afternoon sunshine. Bullman closed the gate behind them with a creak and a bang. Rory squinted up at the sun. How long you think we was in there, Stevie? Hours, Stevie replied. But yet out here it seems like it's only been minutes. So let's go back to Romero's and give him his granddad's comic, and we can ask him to make a pull list for Bullman. Sounds good to me, Rory said. MacReady gave a satisfied chuff to indicate that he too thought this was a great idea. So the boys got on their bikes, Stevie in possession of the cherished comic, but both in possession of innocent hearts that gave them the ability to discern evil in all its many manifestations, but to also see the goodness beyond a grotesque deformation and to willingly befriend a lonely soul.